Comes to this attack yesterday concerning that ISIS leader, how much information have you been briefed on, either by the State Department or the Biden administration, about what went on?
Well, we received a classified briefing yesterday on it, and I must say, having spent time in Syria myself as an airman, it's obviously very important that we continue to root out violent extremism. The terror threat has not gone away. In fact, some would say, and some would argue, especially me as the ranking member on intelligence and counterterrorism, that now the nexus of all these things that we've seen, whether it's Afghanistan or throughout the rest of the world, it's more important than ever to keep our eye on this ball.
As far as the actual operation itself, what did you think of it, and were you supportive of it?
Well, it's obvious that our American military members, the service members who participated in that, are extremely professional. They did a great job. I'm so thankful that nobody was injured, and obviously supportive of continuing to root out the extremists that would do us harm.
As far as the other aspects of the attack, what is it, at least to you, if you had any concerns about the state of Islamic State, especially for events that went on yesterday?
Well, I've got a lot of concerns about the Islamic State, whether it's in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Afghanistan. I think that our ability to use over the horizon, this so-called over the horizon, I'm an airman, I've spent 20 plus years doing air power. And there's estimates that we have 1 to 2% of the capability we did prior to the 31st of August in Afghanistan. So I have a lot of concerns about our ability to monitor, to identify, to detect threats, and then to prevent them.
And do you think then, with the elimination of this leader, what happens to the body itself, and is anybody rising up to take that place already?
Well, certainly there will be somebody else that will fill that gap. I mean, it's when you go after the leader of this organization, it does have a big impact. I applaud the administration for their efforts to do that, and give a lot of credit to the American military for that.
Another story, this is highlighted on the pages of the Washington Post. The State Department and others yesterday talked about this idea that Moscow is considering filming a fake attack in order to justify efforts in Ukraine. What do you think about the story on its base and the larger issues when it comes to what's going on in Russia and Ukraine?
Well, first, before I answer that question, let me just say that information used to be a supporting actor in warfare, and now it's really a primary actor. So the fact that the Russians would even consider using this as kind of a primary means is not surprising. I think that's exactly what information, whether it's through media, social media, or any other type of outlet or medium, this is exactly what we would expect from Putin. It's part of his playbook. He wants to be seen as a victim, and therefore that allows him to achieve his objectives. So it's very dangerous. I hope that we in the Western world can get out in front of this, that we can expose the lies that he uses to be aggressive and to threaten a sovereign country and sovereign borders.
Have you been briefed on specifically that, and do you believe it on its face that actually that Russia is actually in the process of doing this?
Well, I'm led to believe that this could be something that, from open press sources that he would use. And if you just go back to the playbook, whether it was Georgia, whether it was cyber attacks here in the United States, or whether it was the Crimea, this certainly fits the mold. And I'm hoping that we in the Western world can counter that with real information, not misinformation or disinformation.
202-748-8001 for Republicans, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, Independents, 202-748-8002 if you want to call and talk to our guest. The House coming in at 9 o'clock today, Representative August Pfluger of the Homeland Security Subcommittee on Intelligence and Counterterrorism and the Foreign Affairs Committee. You just returned, if I understand it correctly, from a trip in Ukraine. What was the purpose?
Well, it was a bipartisan CODEL. It was led by the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Chairman Meeks. And our number one intent was to show the Ukrainian people our support, that we are behind them. It was very interesting when I met with President Zelensky. We all did. I had the chance to talk to him. The questions that I asked him revolved around energy security, unequivocally, whether it was our meetings with NATO leaders in Brussels, EU leaders in Brussels, or the president of Ukraine himself, Zelensky. The Nord Stream pipeline is by far the most important issue. Energy security is national security. President Zelensky said that his borders matter and that they will fight to protect their borders. And so, there's so much to unpack here on our foreign policy approach. Deterrence doesn't happen at the last minute, and deterrence is not easy. It happens over time. It has to be consistent. And I've got a lot of thoughts on where we've gone wrong with that deterrence approach and why we're in this situation now.
Part of that deterrence, does it include sanctions in your mind? The Senate announced earlier this week they're working on a package of sanctions. We had Representative Ami Barra yesterday talking about Nord Stream 2, and he considers it off the table if there's an attack going on. But as far as the sanctions are concerned, where are you as far as the strength of those sanctions and what it might do to deter an actual attack?
Well, there's so many thoughts on this that some believe that sanctions after the fact will work, that you keep those sanctions open and that creates some sort of leverage over Russia. Here's the fact. Russia created the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and they started it in 2015, immediately after they invaded Ukraine and took the Crimea Peninsula. And so this has been a long time coming. They have the leverage. They have the upper hand. They produce 40 to 50% of the LNG that goes into Europe as a whole. And now they've created a pipeline that completely circumvents Ukraine. And so what I believe on sanctions is that we must be strong. We needed to be strong all along. And now the threat of sanctions after the fact, after an invasion, don't seem to have much weight.
As far as Nord Stream 2, it was the State Department announcing in a briefing last week that if indeed an attack does happen, Nord Stream is off the table. Do you, or at least their words, it wouldn't move forward. Do you, when the administration says that, do you believe it?
It's a good question. I would hope that that's the case. We've heard something similar from Germany, and I would hope that that is the case. But I think in this particular instance, there's one thing that Putin recognizes. I know this because flying in Syria, the Russian Air Force and the Russian military were participating with Bashar al-Assad in Syria in their civil war. Now, we were not at war with Syria. We were not at war with the Russians. But the only thing they recognize is strength. The only approach that they respond to is strength. And so any weakness that they see, and during our trip, it was assumed, because one of the speakers told us that why now, the reason that Russia is going after Ukraine at this point in time is because they perceive an environment of weakness, and that's exactly what Putin will seize upon. So I hope that that's the case, but, it's a little too late in my mind. We needed to have done something before we got to this situation.
Our guest, by the way, graduated from the U.S. Air Force Academy, served as 2 decades as a fighter pilot, commanding and serving in the Pentagon and NATO, as well as a colonel in the Air Force Reserves. When it comes to Ukrainian strength, where is the body of that strength against a possible attack as you see it, sir?
The interesting thing about the Ukrainian people is that for 31 years now, they've had independence. They've tasted freedom. They love being free. And what we learned, and what just, walking on the streets, you can talk to Ukrainian people, and in fact, Russian-speaking Ukrainians. They love Ukraine. They love their country. They love their freedom. I think the biggest and most important factor that they have going for them is that they love being Ukrainian, and they're going to fight for their freedoms. It's not easy. It's not free, but they love that, and they've tasted it, and they want to be a part of that value system.
Our first call for our guest is Doug. He's in Boston, Massachusetts. Democrats line, you're on with Representative August Pfluger. Good morning, Doug. Go ahead with your question or comment.
Hi. Yeah, unlike Russia and unlike Iran, the United States is in Syria without the invitation of the internationally recognized government. Further, the United States is in Syria without congressional approval. And most important of all, the United States is in Syria without the authorization of the United Nations Security Council. In other words, the United States is in Syria in violation of international law. And I'd just like to remind you that George Bush was advised not to travel to Switzerland in 2011 because he was afraid of getting the Pinochet treatment. The laws of universal jurisdiction. So does your guest have any comments? Thanks, and I'll take your answer off air.
That's Doug in Massachusetts.
Well, Doug, I would invite you to look at the authorized use of military force from 2001 to 2003. And I think your statement is not accurate when you assert that there's an internationally recognized regime that has committed genocide against their own people, has used chemical weapons against their own people, and the U.S. Congress in early 2000s authorized force against violent extremists just like that. And so I spent almost a year flying missions in Iraq and Syria against ISIS and terror organizations that threaten the United States. So I would ask you to please go back and look at those facts because that's not true.
Representative Pfluger, it was Speaker Pelosi yesterday saying that a new AUMF is needed, and she also adding that it was harder than it thinks. Let's start with the first one. Do you think a new one is needed, and how should it be shaped?
Well, for sure, I think we do need to look at revising. One of the proposals was that we would take the AUMFs off the table and that we wouldn't have a replacement. And I was against that because I think at this very point, I started the conversation with you earlier by saying that the threat level is extremely high, probably higher than we've seen since World War II. So we need to have that replacement before we actually take it off the table. But certainly Congress, the legislative branch, and this isn't a Republican thing or a Democrat thing, White Houses for many decades have taken advantage of the executive power. And I think we in the legislative branch, a co-equal branch of government, need to get that back here. We do need to look at AUMF and revising it to meet the current threats.
One of the parts of the debate over that is putting a sunset date into a new AMF. What do you think about that idea?
You know, instead of a date, why don't we use conditions? And a date got us into a real pinch. And I think the Biden administration is going to be dealing with the 31 August botched withdrawal from Afghanistan for a long time because of a date. So I'm more for conditions. When the worldwide conditions and the threat level reduces to a point where we don't need to use an AUMF, then that's fine. But when that threat level is still high, why would we use an artificial date?
Here's Deborah, Westchester, Ohio, Republican line for our guest.
Good morning, and thank you for taking my call. I believe that we are currently in a geopolitical warfare. We might not recognize that we are, but it's for energy dominance. Russia wants to control the oil. China wants to control the minerals. I realize that the lithium-ion battery is not your average kitchen table talk, but graphite, the world supply of graphite, cobalt is currently being controlled by China. In Afghanistan, the richest country in the world in rare earth minerals and what we need for our current and future technology, Russia and China are the only two embassies left. They will eventually develop that country, and then terrorists can come out of the Middle East, come out of Afghanistan, and Russia and China have plausible deniability. We need to turn our oil back on because that is our strategic advantage from a civilized nation, and we can trade oil and put Russia and China back. So my concern is that people just don't recognize this. And petroleum controls so many products. Every time you pick up a plastic container, you're picking up a product that comes from petroleum. And we've got to turn our oil back on.
That's Deborah in Ohio.
Deborah, wow. And Pedro, how much time do we have? Because I could talk about this for another hour.
We got 14 minutes, so go ahead.
She's absolutely right. Energy security is national security. It's time for the Biden administration to put Midland over Moscow. What we did when the President of the United States canceled the Keystone Pipeline right here in North America and then greenlit the Nord Stream pipeline is he put money into an autocrat's pocket. Putin is now enriched, further enriched, has more power, and is emboldened to invade the Ukraine right this second because of exactly what Deborah just said. We provide and produce in the Permian Basin, where I represent, the cleanest, most affordable, reliable energy source in the entire world. And it is a geopolitical tool. It is an instrument of power. And instead of being dependent upon Russia or China for energy needs, why don't we provide it to our partners and allies? There is not a single country in Eastern Europe or in Southeast Asia that does not come to my office and others like me asking for more LNG, asking for more power. Deborah, you're absolutely right.
Another related story, Representative Pfluger, it's both the President Xi of China and the President Putin set to meet this week before they go to the Olympics. What's the implications of this meeting as far as geopolitics?
Well, it's extremely important for the world to watch this, to see an autocrat and a dictator getting together. And President Zelensky said something interesting to us last week. He said, when President Putin goes to China just before the Olympics to meet with Xi Jinping, he is going to ask him for his blessing to invade Ukraine. This is a massive event in world history. It changes the course of everything. The value system that was born after World War II that we fought for, that we fought to have freedoms, is being challenged. And this meeting represents everything that we have been trying to deter. And it comes back to energy. It really does. every country and every leader wakes up wondering how they're going to provide energy. We have that resource. We're blessed to have that. We need to use it to make sure our partners and allies are secure.
This is Representative August Pfluger of Texas joining us. Here we'll hear from Ryan in Maryland, Columbia, Maryland, Independent Line.
Hey, sir. Thank you for taking my call. I'm an airman as well, so it's a pleasure to talk to you. I wanted to ask you on Russia, could you maybe talk to some of the broader strokes at play here? I mean, this is kind of Putin pushing back on NATO. I'm sure Taiwan is watching this pretty closely since their international status is objectively grayer than Ukraine's. So I was wondering if I could get your thoughts on what this means broadly and for the future, and what it means for, I guess, U.S. and NATO status on the global stage in general.
Ryan, thank you for your service as an airman and as an independent. I think your question is spot on. This is not a partisan issue. This represents Putin wanting to go back to the hegemony and the empire, maybe viewing himself as a czar. And you're absolutely right to say that China is watching, because this period of weakness, this environment of weakness, I mean, you go back to 2014, we have to be strong. And being strong doesn't mean military invasions, by the way. It means being economically strong. It means getting a good, transparent, fair trade deal around the world in whatever case that we're trying to do. But absolutely, Putin is sensing this environment of weakness. He's testing Western power. He has demanded that NATO go back to pre-1997 levels. And you as an airman, myself as an airman, we know that that is a weaker point than where we are as NATO today. And that's absolutely off the table, unacceptable. And he's not going to dictate NATO terms. Every country has its own right to choose the alliances and the friends that it wants. The Ukraine has chosen Western friends. It wants to be a part of the Western Europe and the value system that we see. Obviously, we're very worried about what China will do with Taiwan and how they're watching and the implications of this period of weakness that could lead to further destabilization.
Representative, we have a viewer who's following up on something you said earlier in the interview. You said, he asked, what does Representative Pfluger mean by Ukrainians, quote, tasted freedom? Can you elaborate more of which freedom specifically? From my uneducated perspective, corruption and general living seem similar in Russia and Ukraine.
Well, sure. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and after the USSR broke up and the Soviet Union was no more, countries like Ukraine declared independence in 1991. And so I should have expanded upon that. It's a great question. So now for 31 years, they are a free country. They have their own governing system. They've been making strides towards being a democracy and allowing the freedoms to every citizen and making sure that their institutions are less corrupt. They've been doing a good job and making gains there. There's more to be made. We've asked them to continue working on that. But the Ukrainian people in general have tasted freedom. And what I mean by that is they are a free country. They have a democracy. They elect their own officials, and they love that form of government rather than what they had previously in the Soviet Union.
Joe in New Orleans, Democrats line. Hello.
Good morning. The subject has been brought up about China and Russia having a meeting. And my thought is, if the two of those countries form an alliance, and if by a miracle, a sad miracle, Trump gets back into office, when Trump was president, he was almost a puppet of Russia. I fear that these three countries will form an alliance and take over the world. Because as Republicans, you all always talk about how Biden, his foreign policy is that of weakness. Then as a representative of this country, then whether he is a Democrat or a Republican, you senators should be on his side for the good of the United States of America, not just for the Republican Party.
Okay, Joe, that's Joe.
Joe, thank you. You're right. We took an oath to the Constitution, and I couldn't agree with you more. And that's the most important thing that I look at. I looked at that as an airman when I took that oath. I believe in it now as a congressman when I took that oath. It's to the Constitution. And I'm not quite sure about the Triple Alliance. I don't think that's probably likely to happen. I would rather not talk about what's going to happen in 2024, but let's talk about what's happening right now. And we still have 3 years of this administration. What we are urging them to do, and what I have been saying since January of 2021, when President Biden took office, was to be strong against those who would do us harm, whether it's terrorism, like ISIS, the program started out with that, or whether it's Russia and the malign influence that they have, cyber attacks into this country, sovereign nations being invaded in the case of Ukraine, or China threatening all of the Pacific. If you want to talk about somebody who is very worried about this situation, it's Taiwan and Japan. And it's because the alliance that we see, and it's not an alliance, it's a cozying up of relationships that we see with Putin and Xi Jinping of China. And absolutely, the administration needs to be strong against that.
Later today, Congressman, there'll be debate over what's known as the Competes Act as far as semiconductors and other things concerning those related issues. Where do you stand on that, and describe for our audience what's going to be debated?
Well, there's many things that are being debated, and really my view on this is we need to be targeted, we need to be precise, and we need to push back against China. For example, I had an amendment that was passed last night, and overall, on the whole, I'm against this bill because it has a lot of wasteful spending. It took a lot of the BBB pieces and parts, and it tried to shove it into this bill. Well, let's focus on China. My amendment was focused on LNG, and it asked the State Department, and it passed yesterday. It asked the State Department to provide a report about how we can use energy. Back to the question from Ohio, how can we use energy to strengthen our partners and our allies? But right now we see an $8 billion slush fund for green energy. I can promise you that the residents and the citizens of Ukraine do not care about that. What they want right now is for their electricity to remain on.
To the act itself, it was Representative Steny Hoyer, the House Majority Leader, in an op-ed saying, in part, the Competes Act will strengthen national security issues by shoring up supply chains and ensuring that we can build in America the semiconductors and microchips that our industries need.
We certainly need to be focused on that. We see several companies that have relocated semiconductors in Texas specifically, and that is definitely something we need to be focused on. There is so much to unpack when it comes to the supply chain issues. I don't think we have enough time to talk about it, but we have to compete with China. The question about where those rare earth minerals are coming from, if we really care about the environment, if we really care about our supply chains, if we really are paying attention to what is going on around the world, we will do a lot of this here, and we will make sure that our supply chains are not dependent and held hostage by other countries like China and Russia.
But to the chip aspect itself, why does this bill, in your mind, doesn't accomplish that goal?
Well, there may be pieces and parts that are aimed at that, but then all these other tag-alongs are weighing it down. And I mentioned one, the $8 billion slush fund. I mean, there was a debate about just an internal debate, not on the House floor, about sending lethal aid in the form of $200 million. We're at $200 million compared to $8 billion. Let's have a real discussion, and let's let the American public have some transparency when it comes to where we're sending this money, what it's going to be used for, and how it's going to help us be more secure in this country.
One more call from a Louisianan, St. Martinville, Louisiana. Kathy, Republican line. Kathy, go ahead.
Yes, good morning, Representative Pfluger. Nice to speak to you. I love your state.
Good morning.
Good morning. My main concern is our national sovereignty. And I want to know how you think your constituents feel about worrying about somebody who's not even a member of NATO and what is happening on your border, our border.
Yes.
What about our national sovereignty?
Kathy, I'm so glad that we're able to end up on this question because it is very important. And I'm on Homeland Security. My number one focus this entire year in the 117th Congress has been border security. My district is less than 100 miles from the border. More fentanyl has crossed into this country. More crime has occurred in this country because of the 2 million immigrants that were apprehended, and that does not include the gotaways. I'm very worried about known or suspected terrorists entering our southern border. We must secure our border. President Zelensky said, we have borders and we will defend them. Why would the United States have any different opinion? This environment of weakness that I refer to, since January of last year, the environment of weakness has started with the lack of security on our southern border. It is absolutely appalling that Secretary Mayorkas has not secured the border, and he claims he has. We're calling on President Biden, Vice President Harris, to go to the southern border to see and interact with the agents that I interact with so often, and to hear their heartbreaking stories about not being able to actually secure it, not being given the tools to secure the border. Kathy, you're so right. We will continue to focus on this. It's heartbreaking to see what has happened, the lack of law and order and the lack of any desire, the abandonment of states like Texas, because this administration is not securing our border.
Our guest serves Texas's 11th Congressional District, Representative August Pfluger. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much.
We will talk over similar issues with our next guest, freshman Democratic Representative Marilyn Strickland, Democrat of Washington State, and we'll have that conversation when Washington Journal continues.
American History TV.